This episode of Access Utah was first broadcast in September.
Welcome to Access Utah. I'm Tom Williams. There are few remaining frontiers on our planet, but perhaps the wildest and least understood are the world's oceans. Too big to police, under no clear international authority, these immense regions of treacherous water play host to rampant criminality and exploitation. Traffickers and smugglers, pirates and mercenaries, wreck thieves and repo men, vigilante conservationists, elusive poachers, sea-bound abortion providers, clandestine oil dumpers, shackled slaves, and cast-adrift stowaways. Drawing on 5 years of perilous and intrepid reporting, often hundreds of miles from shore, Ian Urbina introduces us to the inhabitants of this hidden world in his new book, The Outlaw Ocean, Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier. Ian Urbina is an investigative reporter for the New York Times. He's won the Pulitzer Prize for Breaking News, George Polk Award for Foreign Reporting. Several of his stories have been developed into major feature films. One was nominated for an Emmy Award. Ian Urbina lives in Washington, D.C. with his family. He joins us for the hour on Access Utah. Ian Urbina, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you taking time to be with us. So Bill McKibben, writing about your book, says our planet is 70% ocean, yet to watch TV or read papers, you'd have little idea humans ever ventured offshore. Certainly true. What got you interested in this world?
I mean, I've always been, since I was a little boy, fascinated by the blue on the map in a sort of uninformed, unexperienced way. I didn't grow up sailing or on the water. But then in grad school, I took some time. I was in a doctoral program on anthropology and took some time away, sort of procrastinating my dissertation, and I went and worked on a ship in Singapore, and that really kind of enlivened my curiosity mostly about seafarers and kind of the diaspora tribe of these workers who invisibly traverse the globe and are pretty essential to the world economy, but about which we know very little.
You word invisible there. Why don't we know more about this world?
I think there are a couple reasons. One is geography. It's such a sprawling space, and the things that happen out there, both above and below the waterline, the creatures below the waterline and the people working above them, are invisible to us landlubbers because it's just beyond the horizon. So geography is clearly one reason. I think jurisdiction is another, in the sense that these spaceships, if you will, that happen to be on planet Earth and traveling capsules carrying people and goods, are odd entities, right? They are often owned by a guy in one country and flagged to another country, and the captain is maybe from a third country, and the crew are typically from a fourth and a fifth country, and they're traveling through a space that really, i.e. the high seas, that belong to no country and all countries. And for all of those reasons, this zone out there and the people who work and traverse it are really just far away from your or my consciousness, I think.
This is so foreign. I was so fascinated to learn this because we live in a paradigm of nation states, right, and laws, and there's rivalries between those states, but there is order. So the Outlaw Ocean, the title of the book, this is, as you paint the picture, this is a Wild West out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's and you summed it up well. I think it's outlaw more than illegal, because it's extra legal, and not all that happens there is bad by any means. In some ways, it's more a void than it is an evil place. It's just a place where governments don't really go, and it's almost like a border town of yore, and there are a lot of heroes and villains, and sometimes it's hard to distinguish between them, and sometimes they're the same person in different circumstances. But at the end of the day, there's a lively scene out there, 65 million humans that work in one capacity or another, either on commercial ships moving our tennis shoes and our iPhones and whatever else, or pulling fish from the water for 40% of the protein that's consumed in some countries comes from that space. So there are a lot of people out there working, and that's what drew me for the book.
As you point out, extra legal, there is illegal stuff happening out there, but extra legal as well, and just not a sense of order. And governments, in fact, take advantage of this. You write that the American government chose international waters for example, disassembling Syria's chemical weapons arsenal. That's where they dumped Osama bin Laden's body.
Yeah, I mean, it is a convenient place for its very extra legality. If you want to do things in a way that is removed from the prying eye of reporters or the tedious legalistic eye of advocates and lawyers, etc. And so, yeah, the examples you cite, I just add also, in the sort of extraordinary rendition period, this program that the U.S. government ran where essentially we were using proxy countries to do our dirty work and sometimes in illegal, immoral, and brutal ways extract information from people, be they terrorism suspects or otherwise. Often that had to occur in a nation that was willing to play ball with us being the U.S. government. And at some point, as that story began to break and the world became aware of that program, there was a shift to put more of these suspects on vessels, even though the courts had ruled, look, if you're going to transport a terrorism suspect, you need to do so in an efficient fashion, i.e. put them on a plane or on a truck and get them to the facility where they have access to lawyer and there can be some semblance of compliance with law. The other option is you put them on a ship and you got a long route, a long trip to get there, and that's a lot of time to interrogate. And that's just another example of the sort of crafty use that governments have made of this space.
One comparison that I've heard, I think that you've made this, would maybe illustrate this world is comparison to air travel, right? Airplanes travel through, space, but airspace is regulated differently than the oceans, and so that's produced a whole different world.
Yeah, you're quite right. I mean, I think there's a really important contrast to be studied in looking at the way that people and goods and vehicles travel through that other international, commonly held space, air traffic. And especially post 9/11, but before it too, there was a sort of a legal infrastructure and is a legal infrastructure that most nations comply with, that involves commonsensical things, mandatory clarity on who's on that vessel, right? A crew list, a pre-established destination and clearance that you're allowed to go there from the destination authority. Verification in some form that everyone who got on got off safely and didn't disappear en route. Now, jump over to the sea world. There is this long, reinforced through literature, cultural norm within seafaring that they're different. It's a different space, and the culture of the people who work there are different, and we go by different norms. Just on the vessel itself, the captain being the authority in an unquestioning hierarchical way. That's true on a plane too, but not to the same degree as on a ship. And then also just the lack of tracking and transparency of what happens en route and reporting where you're headed and all those things I listed, crew manifests and these sorts of things. They're not the norm in most fishing vessels, for example, long-haul fishing vessels. There's no expectation that you have to sort of report these things. And I think that's illustrative, and it also gets to the core of the problem, which is how rampant abuses can occur in a sort of endemic way.
As you point out, there are economic advantages for this. If there's no bureaucracy out there, then you can do it cheaper. But there's also no protections, or very few protections for workers, for example.
Yeah, I do think, like, if you view the global economy, well, first of all, if you view this space from an economic perspective, right, you sort of assess it through the lens of the economy and what economic activity is happening there, and you think about the fact that 90% of everything we consume comes by way of ship, you quickly come to the realization that even though the ship is slower and a heck of a lot cheaper, just from a fuel perspective, than, say, putting it on a plane, the other major reason that that statistic is true is that there are very few checkpoints along the way, and there's very little policing and bureaucracy that taxes, in the sense, metaphorically taxes, in terms of time and logistics headache and just pure cost, when you move stuff that way. And there's just a lot less oversight, too, in, like I said, for the reasons we went through before. When the stuff gets to port and it's containerized or it's coming off a fishing vessel, it can move much more efficiently onto trucks than if it's going through an airport. And so for all of those reasons, we as average consumers of all that stuff that comes that way benefit from, sort of tacitly benefit from the hidden savings that come from this outlaw nature.
So everything's connected. So when I'm eating my tuna fish, I guess I need to think about these factors.
Yeah, I think you do. One does. I think it can be overwhelming and demoralizing and debilitating if you think too much about it. But I do think it's a healthy exercise that we as Western consumers especially sort of need to think about, and to the extent that we can and are motivated to try to figure out, are there small things we can do or large things that maybe lessen our complicity in these abuses, by choosing products that maybe have been vetted better and differently because they come with some sort of seal of approval that says in policy terms that this has abided by a higher level of verification on the supply chain. And that's, we're all very busy and we have limited money and we're trying to get the best deal on whatever we're buying, and we don't have a whole lot of time to study these things so rigorously. But, everyone has to decide how much they want to do. But I think in general that exercise is worth attempting.
Let's take a break, and we'll come back, of course, more. Ian Urbina is with us for the hour. The book is The Outlaw Ocean, Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier. Some hair-raising stories here, and a lot of important information. When we come back, I want to talk about some of these abuses that are out there in this extra-legal and sometimes illegal world, including slavery. Ian Urbina writes that slavery at sea is booming. I wanted to ask Ian Urbina as well his experiences being on board a ship for a long period of time. Just that experience that a lot of us don't have. More following this break. Thanks for listening to Access Utah. We're talking with New York Times investigative reporter Ian Urbina. His latest book, fascinating book, The Outlaw Ocean, Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier. He traveled around this world, reporting this book for about 5 years. They're out in international waters. There's a lot going on, and it's not much reported. So this fills a need. The Outlaw Ocean is the book. Should mention you can find Ian Urbina on Twitter at Ian_Urbina. A lot there. And there's a website for the book, theoutlawocean.com. You can respond to this program by emailing us, upraccess@gmail.com, upraccess@gmail.com. So, Ian Urbina, there is slavery at sea. Tell us what the factors that go into this and how this happens.
So it's a radioactive term, right? Slavery. So I always like to try to explain what I mean when I use it. I see slavery or human trafficking, labor trafficking, as sort of a spectrum as in how it occurs. I think you have, especially in the cases that I was looking at, the more acute, extreme versions where you actually have humans who are shackled. And one of the stories that ran in the newspaper initially and got the attention of then Secretary of State John Kerry and the Thai government was specifically about a textbook kind of instance of trafficking where a Cambodian man was enticed into Thailand by what there is called a labor broker, but it's essentially a guy who says he's got access to a decent job, you want to come, and I can get you across the border. You don't need money up front. You don't need papers. It's a good job. And in this case, and this is the norm, it's ostensibly in the construction industry. For females, it's ostensibly as a domestic working in a house as a sort of live-in maid. The females are not actually destined for a domestic job. They're destined for sex industry, and the males are not destined for a construction job. Those are taken by Thais typically because they're good-paying jobs. It's destined for a fishing boat. And so in this case, Lang Long, the guy who was shackled, decides to give it a go. He's desperately poor. This is a chance at something he's never had. He gets in the truck, long journey across the border. He ends up at the port. Next, he's on a boat with a bunch of other Cambodians, and off they go. And that is a very common model on the South China Sea, and a lot of young men and boys are funneled into the Thai fishing fleet in that same structure, typically coming from, Thailand is a relatively middle-class country, less than 2% unemployment, and Thais don't take the worst jobs. Typically, those are migrant workers, typically undocumented, from Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, and they get funneled in this same way. And in Lang Long's case, he attempted to escape. One of the first fishing vessel he was on was caught. He jumped overboard and tried to swim to a supply vessel that had come near. Caught, brought back. Captain shackles him by the neck for months on end while he's not working. He's always shackled. And a subsequent supply vessel saw this, Lang Long shackled, and was disturbed by it. And when he got back to shore, began working with human rights advocates to figure a way to get back out there and to buy Lang Long's freedom. And this shackling is really acute and dramatic. The more often form of this sort of sea slavery, as it's often called, doesn't involve shackles that are metal, but rather shackles that are financial. So it's a debt bondage situation. It's the same basic trafficking story, but it's one in which the labor broker who brings the guy in or the kid in, I interviewed folks who were as young as 13 on some of these boats, they come in without a cent to their name. Now they have a debt with the guy that brought them in, and when they get to the port, that labor broker or trafficker sells the kid or the guy to the captain and says, and the captain pays, $300 maybe for the guy's labor. He goes on board, and the labor broker goes back to the border and does his thing, and the captain goes off to sea, having paid for this individual to work for him. And that's debt bondage. And the worker, the kid, the guy, the young man, is not allowed to leave until that debt disappears. And this is not an unusual thing in the developing world, in factories and mines and such. It's illegal and it's immoral, but it's the norm in many places. But at sea, it's acutely worse just because, there's no bookkeeping and there's no real accounting of today you earn $20 towards your $300 debt. You're on that boat as long as the captain wants you there, and for some of these guys, that's several years.
Are there governments, other entities trying to combat this, especially hard out in the seas? It's international waters, and things are more in a gray area.
Yeah, there are governments and NGO and nonprofit groups that are working hard and have been long before I got on this. And the Thai government in particular, especially after 4 years ago, there was a lot of attention thrown at this by this series, and the Outlaw Ocean, and by the Associated Press, and by the Guardian, and some others, and the U.S. State Department and others really kind of all built a crescendo of concern around this problem, largely based on work by in-country organizations that had been working on it prior. And in the case of the Thai government, I went back to Thailand to re-report all this and to go deeper than I had initially gone, and spent a lot of time with the government, the Thai government, on at-sea inspections, and really tried to in a fair but rigorous way, look at what they were doing well and not so well in countering this. And it's a bit of a dry policy discussion there that I won't bore your readers with, but it's certainly urgent, and it's in the book that there does seem to be in some quarters really good intentions. There's also just endemic corruption and a lack of capabilities at how to actually implement, how to catch this stuff. The type of investigative means that need to be at your disposal to break into these trafficking pipelines is not something you can develop overnight.
If you just joined us, we're talking with New York Times investigative reporter Ian Urbina about his latest book, The Outlaw Ocean, Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier. That's where I want to go next. Mr. Urbina, your experiences out, most of us will never be out there on board a ship, long journey. Tell us what it was like for you.
I whenever I describe it to most normal people around me, they kind of think I'm crazy, largely because the most intense reporting experiences were on the worst ships imaginable, and in that distinctly journalistic way, it's like you're craving to experience and see, and therefore chronicle things that are not, that are virgin, that have not been accessed before, and this realm, has a lot of virgin snow. There's just very little journalism happening out there. My personal experience was, I'm very lucky. I don't get seasick very easily. I think maybe in 5 years it happened once or twice. I do get land sick pretty intensely, and so when I get back to shore, I still have my pendulum is still stuck in offshore kind of motion, and I have odd bed spins standing up, if you will, and sometimes throw up. I find the space out there really weirdly addictive and scary and beautiful and otherworldly. It's at once inducing of agoraphobia and claustrophobia all at the same time, because you're in a unusually open space. I grew up in cities. I'm used to having limited view of the horizon, trees and tall buildings and people everywhere, and this is the opposite, sky as far as you can see and just nothing to lay your eyes on. So it's agoraphobic in that you're just so exposed, and when weather starts kicking up, you feel really exposed. It's claustrophobic in the sense that you're in this little capsule, stuck with these people, and for a long time. And within the capsule, everyone has sub-niches that they're supposed to maintain, and you really got to learn how to be small, not just literally, not physically change your size, but just in personality, how much attention you take, how much you talk or don't, walking down the hall, just how to move differently. And I find that all really interesting, sort of like I'm on a spaceship and having to rejigger fundamentals. So I really like it. I just got back a week and a half ago from another. I'm still reporting on this stuff and was in the Gambia at sea. And I was just reminded as we leave port, this strange kind of existential exhale that comes over me as I head back out into the great expand. I really quite like it.
You were describing to your publisher in an interview You're out there on a fishing boat. The 15-foot swells, and the deck is covered with fish innards. Becomes like a skating rink. There's some dangers.
Yeah, and that's quite right. I think the dangers that are there, sure, there are bad people that my photographer, representing a guy named Fabio Nascimento, and I kind of came in contact with and had to extract ourselves from, very carefully. But the real dangers, the more prevalent dangers, are the ones you describe. It's the conditions. So, like you say, it's this. Imagine a developing world factory, right? So none of the OSHA guards on any of the machinery that's running 24/7, especially at night. The factory floor happens to function like an elevator that's going up 3 floors and down 3 floors continually. It's also skating rink slippery, and there's jagged stuff everywhere, some of it moving, fishing gear and spinning winches, and they're crowded. Like when it's heavy on and you're pulling in a huge 50-ton net, you have 40 Cambodians who are really savvy and adept on their feet, and many of them barefoot, and I've never seen them fall. And you're trying to film and report, but you really got to stay out of their way and not step on the wrong thing. And then there's all these hidden dangers, like you need to know where the pipes are that heat up, red hot heat up, because if you're rocking and you're trying to climb from the back to the front and you're shimmying across a railing to get around these barrels where all the ice is, you grab the wrong pipe and you're going to burn the skin off your hand, which is one thing that I did, on one trip, because I hadn't done my homework and figured out how to crawl across safely. Or, you're going to, little threats too. I had a bad habit before this reporting of biting my nails, and on an early trip got a really severe infection, and realized that could kill you. If you don't have antibiotics with you and you're not going to be back to shore for weeks, and that gets infected enough, they're not going back. You're lucky to be on there as a guest. They're not going to change their... So you just really need to be careful about hygiene and really... And these are dirty places. I mean, there's rotting fish and rats and roaches and everywhere. So that part of it is really grueling in a way that I've never experienced in on-land reporting.
Mm. And this is where our fish is coming from that I'm eating. That's it's not reassuring.
There's some cleaning steps in between what I describe and your plate, hopefully. But,
yeah. I was fascinated. You have talked about, you referenced this a little bit earlier, about the social mores. In fact, you say on one of these ships you talked to the British first mate. He says you want to fit in, take up as little space as possible. He wasn't just talking about physical space. Yeah.
There's this thing that sort of, I don't know if I did well in the book or not, but I tried, which was, I came from cultural anthropology background, and I kind of was viewing the space and the culture and these people and their language and their laws or lack thereof, their norms, their lore, everything, their hierarchies, their modes of discipline, like as if I had been airlifted into an Amazon tribe, right? That no one had checked in with for forever, and so I was trying to take it all in, and one of the things I noticed that felt very distinct was the role of silence on these ships, and how much reverence there was to silence, and how it lived in some places on the ship bigger than others. So you're in the engine room versus you're in the galley, meaning the dining room, kitchen, versus the bridge, meaning where the officers and the captain are. The engine room is not a silent place. It's an incredibly noisy place, but in terms of chit-chat, it's completely impossible and dysfunctional, and if you attempt it, it really irks the engineers because they got to take off their gear to not be rude and to try to figure out what you're saying to them, and it's very irksome. So you don't talk in the engine room. You just don't, unless there's a serious emergency. In the galley, people are usually between shifts. They're either just waking up from their 4 hours of sleep and about to head back down to the factory and they're kind of head down, buried in their space. And you may talk with someone, but you're not talking with the group because the groups are on different shifts, and you're keeping your voice down. You're really kind of library etiquette there, but the talking is kosher. You get on the bridge, and talking is a super hierarchical thing. You don't enter the bridge without permission, without verbally asking for permission. And what talking is occurring is cockpit type, militaristic, get to the point, functionalistic, kind of utilitarian conversation. Unless it's the middle of the night and there's nothing happening, and these guys are passing the time, making sure they don't run over someone, and those guys might talk. But generally speaking, so this is just one example. I'm probably going too deep here, but of sort of a cultural norm that took some getting used to. And when that guy told me, be small, take up little space, he was talking about, respect the silence, respect the hierarchy, don't spread your stuff out physically, but also don't be a large presence.
You were in some dicey situations. You went out to Somalia, right, where you report that piracy is making a bit of a comeback.
Yes, the Somalia experience was, among the hairiest, and it wasn't meant to be. I went there actually initially intending to tell a good news story of the effort of the country to better police its water and this sort of unusual collaboration that had occurred between law enforcement in Kenya and Somalia to nab these scofflaw poachers who had been raiding Somali waters for years. And when I got there, I got to Mogadishu, and then we had to start this long trek to this one state called Puntland, which is, if you look at the map, it's literally the rhino horn part of Africa. It's the horn that sticks towards Yemen. And Puntland is a state, Somalia is really not a functioning nation. It's kind of Mogadishu, barely controlled by federal authorities, and then a bunch of tribally run, sort of ostensibly called, states. And Puntland is kind of like Texas to Washington, D.C. It's part of the country, but really doesn't view itself as such, and culturally sort of resents any attempt by federal authorities to impose rule there. And Puntland is also in a really dicey spot in that a lot of the illegal arms and guerrillas that are heading over to Yemen to fight and coming back, they launch from Puntland. A lot of the pirates from your Captain Phillips movie, they were launching from Puntland. A lot of the illegal khat, which is a kind of a drug, it's a plant that's true. It's an amphetamine, essentially, that's common over there, is in Puntland. So Puntland is this really lawless place, and it has one of the bigger ports, Bosaso. And so Fabio and I wanted to go there and tell this story of this success. I won't bore you now with the story. You can read the book. But when we got there, everything changed, and the invitation we had received from local authorities dissipated overnight when they feared that we were going to actually report on what became the more interesting story, which ultimately I did report on because they were so worried about it, which was deep-seated corruption by Puntland authorities who were in cahoots with really abusive foreign fishing boats that were, routinely using human slaves and involved in all sorts of illegal stuff. And there was a fleet of them parked right there when we got there, and so we fell out of favor with the local authorities. We got trapped and had to hide out for a while until we could find a way out of Puntland, because you can't travel by road because of ISIS and Al-Shabaab terrorist groups. So that was a very scary, frankly, experience, and I'm glad we made it out.
And yet you keep going back. I guess there's an adventurous spirit you have to do this kind of work.
Yeah, I think you get addicted to the story, and you'll also feel that if you're going to believe the sort of public service journalism fifth estate narrative, that there is some utility served by shining a light on these abuses, and you maybe can contribute in some way to correct them by chronicling them, then you kind of feel a growing sense of duty that the worst stuff you see, and then you come back to your comfortable home, you feel kind of obligated to go back and continue trying to do right by those people.
Do you feel like your reporting of others, is moving the needle on some of these abuses?
On Monday I do, Tuesday I don't. Mm-hmm. Wednesday I kind of am not sure. It varies. I think, I don't think if you think of this place and this topic and this lawlessness as a war, I don't think I can do the math to figure out if am I helping the war. I do think isolated battles on individual topics on certain fronts, the reporting is helping, sometimes a lot. You see it. Lang Long, the guy I talked about, the shackled guy, his life, I think, was radically changed for the better by what came of that reporting. I think the Thai government moved a lot in response to the reporting on this issue, and other fronts, the reporting of abuse of stowaways, the reporting of a murder that we caught on camera, reporting of intentional dumping by ships. These isolated topical targets that we went after, I do think there's been some progress as a result.
You wrote in this interview with your publisher that I referenced before, you say something very interesting. There's an emotional toll, and it's not the emotional toll that I would have guessed. It's you talk about when you come home and you feel like you're living in between two worlds.
Yeah, I think it's maybe akin on a much... I will always want to be very respectful and careful about making this comparison, but when I've read about people returning from war, and the sort of challenges of reacclimating, I feel like they are describing something that is similar to what I have felt. And I think it's at root largely because I'm spending a long time in a very, very different place, seeing very intense things and living, in a way that's so different, staying up for 48 hours and then sleeping for 6 and then, just everything is so different from my normal life here at home. And then the things I'm seeing are really emotionally draining. And when you get back, I struggle sometimes with figuring out how and whether to describe them to the people, to my family, because in the act of trying to describe them, it sounds like you're amping it up, and that feels gross, and disingenuous. But in the act of not describing them, you are alienated from the people you love, and they're wondering what you've seen over there and why you're reluctant to talk about it. So I think that emotionally is something that just is difficult. And it's also why you get very close with the people you report with. Like I said, Fabio, my photographer, and there's a bond there that I think is very unusual. And I've heard this from other reporters who spent a long time in war zones, and they get very close because you've just shared those experiences with only that person.
There's another thing you talk about, and this I know good journalists do struggle with this. You've talked about it, that you're trying to help people by getting the word out, right? But then you worry about exploitation, and there can be a fine line. I wonder how you deal with that.
I don't know whether I deal with it well. I mean, I do grapple with it. You summed it up perfectly. I think if you're honest about this kind of work, then you have to reckon with the possibility that you're engaged in misery porn, and that you are profiting in a certain way from the agony of others, and because you're bringing their stories back and you're putting them in the newspaper or in a book or in a movie, and it's promoting your career, and you're talking about them on radio interviews, and so it's sort of on the other hand, the hope is that you're doing that for the purpose of raising awareness and all that. But I I think, and I don't know. The things I try to do to cope with it are, one, be really rigorously honest about the tension there, and think about it as often as I can. And number two, always, I try to funnel the sense of guilt I have and worry I have into doing a better job at the chronicling job. And when I'm in theater, if I'm falling asleep, and I often get an extra surge of motivation when I think, okay, I'm only going to be here for one more week, and I should push a little bit harder to do right by these folks. And so let me type up those notes, or let me head back out on deck to go talk with that guy that I didn't get time to, and capture more and reduce it better. And, just you really lean into it a little bit harder as motivated by those worries. That's just what I try to do with that negative energy.
Mm-hmm. If you just joined us, we're talking with Ian Urbina. He's an investigative reporter for the New York Times. The latest book, fascinating book, The Outlaw Ocean, Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier. We'll take another break, come back with our last 10 minutes or so. When we come back, I want to talk about, this is something, again, I didn't know. There's a large number of people stranded at sea. I want to talk about that. And then the environmental concerns. In some ways, the oceans have been turned into a junkyard. There's illegal dumping and other environmental concerns. I want to talk about those two things from the book. The book is The Outlaw Ocean, and Ian Urbina is the author. More following this break. You're listening to Access Utah. I'm Tom Williams. We reached our last segment with Ian Urbina. He is an investigative reporter with the New York Times. The latest book's fascinating book, The Outlaw Ocean, Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier. If you have a question or comment, you can get that to us at upraccess@gmail.com, upraccess@gmail.com. Ian Urbina's Twitter account is fascinating. Ian_Urbina, at Ian_Urbina. And you can find more about the book at the book's website, theoutlawocean.com. I want to get into people stranded at sea, but I'm Ian Urbina. I'm looking at your Twitter account. You have a video here of a near collision. And you say, I experienced ship collisions in Palau, Thailand, and Indonesia. I can honestly tell you it's more violent and panic-inducing than a car crash. It sounds like it would be.
Yeah, it's kind of slower. The stakes are higher in some ways, right? Because if you're going to sink if at the end of that collision, which is kind of scarier than what ends in a car crash. And then the things are bigger, right? You're on a huge ship, and the collisions are often, they kind of drag out. And so it's just, once the one vessel hits the other, it kind of keeps on hitting for sometimes a couple minutes, because they're almost attached to each other. And so for all those reasons, it's really scary. And a lot of the vessels I was on were not steel-sided kind of patrol vessels like the one in that video, but rather fiberglass, cutters. And those things are just not built for collision. It's glass. Anyway, it is very scary.
So a large number of people stranded at sea. I didn't know that. How does this happen?
So, I think this in some ways is one of those tragedies that, rape and murder and slavery are really intense and dramatic and grab attention, but, abandonment of seafarers is far more widespread and in some ways equally consequential because it ruins people and their families and unfolds in slow motion. What typically happens, the scenario is, the higher end, the container ships are a different order, but the middle tier vessels that move cargo and fishing vessels are in markets that have very tight margins. You can't make a whole lot of money on them, and you really got to be careful. And so a lot of these go financially belly up, the owners do. And a lot of them are owned by shell companies that are within shell companies that are within shell companies, and there's a P.O. box business on top of that, and a guy over in a country you never even knew was involved that actually owns all things. So they're layered, in really intricate ways. And what all that spells is when a ship runs into problems, someone buys it from someone else, it doesn't pay a debt and they get hit with charges, something breaks that's too expensive to fix, whatever. Sometimes the owners or the ownership company cuts their losses and walks away. And those ships are sometimes at sea, and they have 20, 30 guys on them, and usually from the developing world. And the captain just can't get the phone call returned and has no idea what's going on. And they run out of fuel, and they drop anchor maybe a mile offshore because they don't have clearance to come into port. But they're trying to stay near land until they can figure out what's going on. And this is freakishly a common occurrence, and it's really dramatic because sometimes for upwards of a year or 2 years, these guys are stuck on this sort of floating prison cell, and they don't have the papers or the money or the government clearance to come to land. They don't have any way to fly home. They don't have the fuel to direct the ship back home. Maybe something's broken. Maybe they just don't have the funds. And so they just wait. And usually, Mission to Seafarers or one of these amazing organizations that specializes in ports on these very issues gets involved. But, these are tiny organizations with a staff of 3, and they're only in a handful of places around the world. And so if you're unlucky enough for this to happen elsewhere, then you're kind of out of luck. And so I had heard a lot about this problem as I traveled the world, and so I focused for a chapter on how it unfolds, and I shadowed one of these heroic, in this case a minister with Mission to Seafarers, who in the Middle East, where it's especially acute for reasons of the oil industry and shifting prices and such, was dealing with a lot of these cases on a daily basis and was going out and bringing water to these guys and trying to negotiate some sort of method for them to get home.
Just have a couple of minutes left, maybe the 2-minute version of, this is unfair, of the environmental problems out there. It's not only ships dumping, but it's us, right? And all the plastics that we're sending out into the oceans, it's become a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, the fast version, like you said, is, a huge culprit is us on land, and it's landfills that are too close to rivers, and a lot of plastic that ends up in rivers that eventually ends up in the ocean, and the statistic that's often bandied about is there'll be more plastic by weight in the ocean by 2040 than fish. There's a real problem of dumping, indirect and direct dumping at sea.
And we'll send people to the book for some fascinating stories, including Sealand, which is there's a family that's taken over an island, declared their own nation. Surprisingly difficult to settle sovereignty out there, I guess.
It is. That is one of the funner chapters to write and report.
Yeah. And there's a gynecologist who's providing abortions offshore, in adjacent to nations that have made abortion illegal. So a bunch of stories in the book. So just a minute left. Where are you still going to be going out there reporting on this? Where are you off to next?
Yeah, so I'm going to stick with the topic and report for another 4 or 5 years on this. Just back from the Gambia. Before that was in South and North Korean waters, and next up is Libya, looking at the refugee situation and refugees that are trying to travel from Africa to Europe. So continuing on with the reporting.
Well, it's fascinating, important reporting. The book is The Outlaw Ocean, Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier. And Ian Urbina, the author, has been with us for the hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks for listening to Access Utah.